We are going to explore a concept that is both disruptive and innovative, reminding us of the main topic of this year's conference. Constructive journalism is a concept that has been around for a little while, but not all of us know exactly what it can actually do for media organizations, and that's something we want to find out about, because all of us have had the feeling at some point or another, especially during the pandemic, that feeling that you just can't take it anymore. The negatively charged news have taken people to a point where they do not want to know anything anymore. They don't want to see, read, and listen to news, and that has bad consequences, of course, for our democracies. So maybe there is time and a solution to rethink the way we're doing journalism. And the next short clip will take us through a brief introduction about this panel, Beyond Who, When, What, Where, and How, Exploring Constructive Journalism.
Disruptive developments, calling for radical innovations. Digitization has sparked dynamic shifts that are changing our everyday lives. Do you want to understand how and why? Let's get to it.
Information overload. What can constructive journalism do about it? How can we provide solutions instead of always addressing problems? Beyond who, what, when, where, and how.
And a very warm welcome. I'm Javier Arguedas, again, a journalist and news anchor at Programs for Latin America here at Deutsche Welle. We want to explore, and to explore, we need some good guides. And we have 3 of them today with us, and I'm going to introduce them to you. First, here to my right-hand side is Ellen Heinrichs. She is DW's head of trends and knowledge, and she has built up a circle of constructive journalism within our organization, together with partners and employees, of course, in our 30-language departments. Welcome, and I'm very glad to have some company here on the stage.
Thank you, Javier. I'm very happy to be here as well.
We also have partners and guests from overseas. I'm going to start with Ruona Meyer, who you can already see. She is a journalist, media trainer, and consultant from Nigeria, and she is the head of the Africa Initiative at the Solutions Journalism Network. A very warm welcome to you, Ruona. Thank you for being here with us today. And Ulrik Haagerup is the CEO of the Constructive Institute. He has set a very high goal of changing the global media and news culture around the world, and has also worked as the executive director of Denmark's most important broadcast network, public broadcaster that is, in the news department. To all 3 of you, I'm very glad that you're here, because we have a combination of knowledge and experience in a field that is relatively new. And I would like to start by asking a question to all 3 of you. Normally, we could start a panel like this asking things like, what is constructive journalism? But I think most of us have at least a clear or at least a little notion about it. So maybe I'm just going to start asking you, Ruona, what is the biggest misconception about constructive journalism that you have come across in your work?
I think the biggest misconception is that constructive journalism can actually be a silver bullet, or that constructive journalism needs to be funded. That's the biggest misconception I've seen. Within that, you tend to see people thinking that constructive journalism has to be separate from all types of journalism. It's basically an approach to every single type of journalism, investigative, environmental, peace, and conflict. So those are the types of things I'm saying.
Ellen, what is your biggest misconception that you've come across during your years working with constructive journalism?
Well, I see a lot of journalists having strong aversions against constructive journalism, to be honest, because they have the misconception that constructive journalism is maybe fluff or even PR, because they consider reporting about solutions as not as valuable at first sight as reporting about problems. And I think that's wrong. And if I had a lot of time, I could explain to you why. But I think it's pretty obvious that telling stories about relevant problems is just doing half of the job, right? I think it's really crucial, even in times of conflict, that people get to know more. They need to hope, they need some sort of, what can I do about it? Because that really, really adds relevance to our reporting for the people, because otherwise you just, been left helpless, maybe angry.
Yeah.
That's what's happening if people get just confronted with problems all the time.
Now, Ulrik, you have been considered one of the pioneers of constructive journalism for sure. So I assume you have a lot of experience and have also seen lots of these misconceptions about the concept as such. What would your biggest example be?
A lot of good reporters and editors around the world, they start to think that constructive journalism is an alternative to being critical, and an alternative to do investigative journalism, and it is not. And just as Ellen said, this is not about happy news or fluffy news, taking the teeth out of the watchdog. You can't be constructive without having a well-documented important problem to be constructive about. Otherwise, it's just nice. So I think the idea that constructive journalism is not a North Korean version of journalism is the most important thing.
Now, let's talk about where we stand globally and how advanced the concept of constructive journalism is. Ruona, I would like to start asking you, I, for example, come from Costa Rica, a country that is very often a subject in constructive journalism stories, if you will, about the environment, about helping indigenous communities, for example. But in the end, if you take a look at journalism in Costa Rica for Costa Ricans, constructive journalism is almost nowhere to be seen. What's your experience working with the African countries? Because I also have the impression that African countries are often subject of topics about constructive or in constructive journalism.
So, Javier, you've really hit on what I'm trying to say. Constructive journalism is being put into a box that it has to be funded by some external party before it can be done. And this is changing actually in Africa, particularly based on the work that both the Constructive Journalism Institute is doing and also the work that the Solutions Journalism Network is doing. One of the things I will lay blame on is the fact that a lot of our funding systems, aid systems, are actually arranged along the lines of colonialism. And while that has not really happened in journalism, so for instance, you see that the British will fund Commonwealth countries, Portugal has arrangements with Brazil, France focuses on Francophone countries. We need to continue guarding against that happening to journalism, because once that happens, it will always be that something as fluid as journalism, something as constructive as journalism will now be in the box of colonialism. But thankfully, that is not yet the case, so we must avoid that.
And you were talking about funding as one of the crucial aspects, and that's something I would like to talk to you about, Ellen, because you have actually researched about the impact of constructive journalism in some media organizations. I work in a newsroom. We know that dramatic negative news will bring clicks, will impact people. And some companies do not have the privilege that we have of Deutsche Welle of being publicly funded. They rely on advertising, for example, and on the reach they can generate. So is there a business case for constructive journalism?
Yes, absolutely. We get more and more evidence that constructive journalism is good for business as well as not just good for societies. You said, if there is breaking news, we'll have lots of reach, we'll have lots of views and clicks. But the thing is, people will leave very quickly. They'll read your headline and then they'll be gone. I've done a research work in Germany, but I've also talked to a lot of colleagues who are, reporting for the international markets here at Deutsche Welle, and all of them say we can really see that people tend to stay longer if my reporting includes some sort of solution or includes surprising angles or different sorts of perspectives, diversity in the reporting, and that makes it a business case, right? Because if you are a company who is relying on the advertisement business model, these viewers, these users you've got will be exposed to advertisement much longer. And plus, they might even be in a much better mood because they don't feel frustrated by the negativity focus of your reporting. Another thing is subscriptions. I have talked to a regional German newspaper called Sächsische Zeitung, and they had really figured out that solutions reporting did actually contribute to subscriptions. So they saw a lot of conversions that they could track back. You never can do it to 100%, but they think they can track it back to constructive reporting. That's why they have even introduced a tick box in their CMS where the editors can say, this is a constructive report because this report is going to be ranked higher. And I think that's great evidence that constructive journalism does really make a business case.
So it seems like the obvious thing to do, but Ulrik, you have worked, of course, with many media organizations, and the question that I have in mind sometimes is, where do you start? Let's assume someone watching works at a media organization that does not really include constructive journalism as a concept yet in their culture. Where do you begin? How do you approach that topic in a media organization?
A good starting point would be go out on the street and ask simple questions to people like, excuse me, ma'am, do you need more information in your life? And wonder what they will say. You could also ask them, do you need more news? And do you need it faster? And the truth is, we all know what people will answer. They will say, no, we don't need more news. We need better news. We don't need more information. We need somebody to clean up the mess. We want to have a fair and accurate picture, give us news we can trust. So if we start listening to people and also start listening to ourselves to say, I want to tell important story that engages people. So it all starts there. Why are we here? What is journalism? What's it all about? Why do we go to work every day? Why do we have public service media? Why do we do journalism? And all these questions are very easy to answer. We know it by heart, but we are so busy in our daily life with all these deadlines, we don't have time to think. So we just give people more and more, faster and faster. No. And that has consequences.
It definitely does. And it is also not easy to change the mindsets of people in and outside of the organizations. Ruona, you have experience as a media trainer as well and as a consultant. So one of the questions that is very important is to what extent constructive journalism, because that's a notion many people have, is limited to a handful of topics. You mentioned that already briefly, but I think it's important to delve into that. And how can we cover all sorts of stories in that way?
So one of the main ways we can achieve this is if we actually bring in the people who we will be teaching, and we teach them in the formats that are relevant to their lifestyle, relevant to their needs, and relevant to their learning levels. One of the good things that Constructive Journalism Institute has done is they've actually gotten academics, they've gotten journalists, they've gotten civil society members to sort of design one of their curriculum. I think Ulrik can talk more about that. But that's the kind of example I'm talking about. At the Solutions Journalism Network, we won't stop at just one language. We actually have 17 languages, resources in about 17 languages. We are also looking at actually helping people we train under a train-the-trainer program to also further develop it. For example, there have been talks of people where they feel WhatsApp is the best way to teach. Some people think PDF files as opposed to Zoom. So it is this diversity in practice that constructive journalism has that the learning also has to have. The learning also has to have diversity. And even the shaping of the content has to have diversity. So the way investigative journalism is practiced in Africa is different from the way it is practiced in the US, mainly because even databases are different. So all these things are what we take into account when we make presentations, webinars at Solutions Journalism Network for learners in the US as opposed to learners in Africa. And I think always being mindful of these differences, celebrating this diversity, in how we produce content for learners will be very key.
So just as constructive journalism starts at the users when we are talking about the products, it starts at the people who are learning about it when we train them. On that note, I'd like to make a very brief public service announcement, because many of you may know the DW Akademie, which is our learning unit here at Deutsche Welle. And they are starting a constructive journalism fellowship, where 15 visual journalists from the Middle East and Africa will have the opportunity to get trained by experts from DW Akademie, and also get grants for productions, and of course join a network. Subscriptions, or rather applications for this fellowship are open from today and until July 15th. I think you can already see the website in your screens right now. It's dw.com/constructive-journalism-lab. That's dw.com/constructive-journalism-lab. Now, I'd like to turn to you, Ellen, because we were talking about training journalists, but also the culture in newsrooms. And of course, we here have people from many different countries with very different views. How do you deal with resiliences? How do you deal with conceptions about what journalism has to look like that can be very different depending on where you come from and what you have experienced?
To be honest, I don't think that the conception is so much different in different parts of the world, because I think the prejudices against constructive journalism are almost everywhere the same. It's mainly about being not critical enough. And then it has really, really helped to show good examples, to make it very practical, to not, just leave it on the theoretical level and say, this is a new type of ideology that you have to follow, although you've got like 20 years of professional experience. Just tell people, if you want to be a really, really good reporter, you can just go one more step. Please ask also about solutions, ask about different perspectives, ask about, the impact basically that you want to achieve with your journalism, because most journalists, they do want to have some sort of impact. That's why they've become journalists, right? And one more thing, Ruona has talked about training, and training is really, really important. Tell people there is a way to change their habits of reporting, but also tell their superiors, tell the media management about it. Because as to you said it's also about innovation in journalism. And my personal experience with innovation is, it doesn't lead nowhere if you don't also include the management. So they have really to tell people this is the way to go, just as DW's CEO did this morning when he said Deutsche Welle is getting more and more solution-oriented. And I'm sure this is something people in the newsroom have well perceived, and I think something's going to happen. I'm very, very happy about it, that obviously.
We all are, all of us who work here. Now, Ulrik, speaking of management, you yourself were a manager of a news department in a public broadcaster, and you have worked with media organizations. I know every single media outlet is different, but is there a particular way in which it makes more sense to integrate the concept of constructive journalism, as in, should media companies try to have a department? Should they have a special product dedicated to constructive journalism? Or should they simply go on about training their staff so all of them are somehow trying to change that perspective? Is there a special better way to deal with this as an organization?
There are several approaches, but you're right. It's not about that a manager and editor-in-chief gets on a course and suddenly say, oh, now from Monday, I send out an email from Monday morning, we do constructive journalism, and here's the manual. And then it will happen. No, as we have talked about, we are very, very conservative. We all want progress, but nobody wants change. But this is about change. If you do as you have always done, you probably get the results you always gotten. And our results in the media business are not very good. So sometimes the culture in newsrooms are very, very strong. So it could be a good idea just to start with a program. The BBC has been talking about solution-focused journalism for years, but at the core of what they do, it's still very focused on the traditional way of producing news. They have programs around it, but they haven't really gotten to the bottom of it. So thinking that this is both a mindset, as we heard before, but it's also concrete tools. And it's not about being constructive on all stories all the time, every single aspect that you're covering. If there's a big bomb going off right now in Bonn, the big job for news organizations would be to cover it. What has happened? Where did it happen? How many people were killed? But maybe then on day 2, you will start thinking, why did this happen? But then on day 3, you need to have it to facilitate a conversation about now what and how. How do we avoid this happening again? And that's the constructive approach. So the overall package includes the constructive mindset, but not every story has to be constructive all the time. But on the subject we cover, we could add constructive mindsets and elements of reporting in it.
Now, I'd like to get back to Ruona because we also want to encourage, of course, everyone to, join in and to try to, rethink the way they are working. Do you have examples of best practices where you would say this was a success and this worked very well in one specific context?
Would that be in line with constructive journalism?
Yes, an example where you would say, I approached this group, this organization, or this individual journalist. We worked together, and this is how it turned out. Is there a best practice that you could tell us about?
Yes, there actually are several, but I will speak about one particular newsroom that is a small newsroom. And they opened a solutions journalism desk in Nigeria. And they report on conflict on the whole Sahel region. I mean, without any sort of training, they only used the online resources. They were able to publish a whole series of how the community is using solutions journalism, of how the community is using solutions to bring about peace. So they introduced that constructive approach to the journalism. And not only did they get recognition for that, they also began to factor in that desk in their talk with donors in raising money for more work. They also endeared themselves to their readers because they published this in other languages, namely Hausa. But one of the main things is when you look at the bigger picture, Javier, they are reporting in a time when conflict has risen sharply over the last decade. At least 96 countries, hosted one violent demonstration across the world in 2019. If you bring it to sub-Saharan Africa, where my little newsroom is, we had 32 riots and protests alone in 2011. But that figure in 2018, guess what? 292. I mean, so when you look at the fact that conflict is becoming a really big factor, it's even becoming an economy. We have a conflict economy. We have conflict entrepreneurs who are making money off of this on the back of conflict. When you take into account what that little newsroom was able to achieve, the fact that two communities that could never see eye to eye were on the same page, were on the same digital form, their voices on a podcast, sitting side by side. That is the possibility of constructive journalism. And I really hope it's an example that continues as the Constructive Institute and Solutions Journalism Network continue what we're doing.
That's really, really inspiring, and that's exactly what we would like to, tell everyone to really take a deeper look at. Now, then, working at Deutsche Welle with people from, again, many departments, do you have examples where you say this is a line of work that was very successful and that we would like to share?
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many great examples, and I'd invite everybody to have a look at dw.com to see them. I could maybe mention two examples. One would be Balkan Booster, which is obviously a format that's dealing with Balkans and is directed towards younger audiences. And we know that especially young people do need this constructive approach. They know that they are in the mess. They know that the next crisis is just around the corner. They have to deal when it comes to the Balkans with these recent past of intense conflict. There is so much prejudice, there's so much bias, and Balkan Booster does really help young people in the Balkans to overcome this sort of bias. Then there is the 77%. It's an extremely constructive format, again, in Africa. And we invite, for instance, people to have debates on the streets in several African countries. We invite them to have debates over issues that they normally don't discuss in these societies. We as journalists do have another role there. We're just not only the reporters, we are also facilitators of constructive dialogue. And that's, I think, a very, very important thing that constructive journalism can do. Help people engage in constructive dialogues, because all of our societies these days do really have to deal with conflicts. It's about polarization. It's about, the conflicts Ruona has just mentioned. So there is a need for journalists, to be able to deal with conflict in a more constructive way and not just report on it.
Now, Ulrik, reading through a few of your biographies, I came across a description that said that you wanted to change the global news culture within 5 years. That seems to me to be a very short period. What exactly do you mean by that, and how are you planning to achieve that?
The idea, if you say we want to do something in 100 years, I mean, you will not work very hard. If you say you want to do it in 5, you really have to get up early every day. We have 1 year left. We started 4 years ago. Solution Journalism Network is doing some. I mean, Lasche this morning announced something will happen in Germany. Around the world, more and more people say there's something we need to do differently, and we need a common language, a vocabulary, just like when good colleagues 25 years ago invented the word investigative journalism. That was a word of quality journalism. But because suddenly we had a word, we had a vocabulary, we could start talking about it, and then we could start teaching it. And we could find out, how do we interview people who don't want to answer our critical questions? How do we get the documents out? Same thing with the idea of a constructive journalist. It's just a word, but now we can talk about quality in a new way. So it's not said that in 1 year every news organization has changed, but in the Scandinavian countries, most newsrooms now talk about this. Some of them have even included it in their news strategy. More and more are adding on. People apply for fellowships, they do training with solution journalism, and they do it with us, they do it with Deutsche Welle. This is spreading very rapidly because now we have a common language, and that's what's important. We'll make it because we need it.
That's definitely something that has come across already, that it is really urgently needed. And on that note specifically, Ruona, we don't want to focus too much on the coronavirus pandemic because it has been talked through in and out. But still, I would like to ask you, from your impression, do you think on one hand, we know that constructive journalism is on the rise. On the other hand, the coronavirus pandemic was very marked by very dramatic news around the world. Do you think that the pandemic has brought the concept forward, or that it rather has posed a challenge?
It actually has brought the concept forward, Javier, and that is because it's forced a rerouting of systems of reporting. So when nobody could move, nobody could be parachuted in, and that increased skills for marginalized journalists in marginalized communities. Because this was a global pandemic, every aspect, every location where it happened was newsworthy. So it also brought out support for funding, support in terms of skills. And what we've seen with the pandemic is that travel is not going to be the same anymore, is it? I mean, we're here using Zoom and everything, having echoes in our presentations. But what that means too is that this transfer of skills is going to be prioritized. And I can only say that is a very good thing for constructive journalism, because as Ulrik has pointed out already, practicing it takes skill. Helen has already mentioned that. It's part of why I'm also happy that there's German support for this as well, tangible support, because when we have these systems, these structures being built, whether it was based on the necessity of a pandemic or not, they will exist and we'll be able to utilize them further. So in that way, I'm grateful that the pandemic has made us really re-examine systems of learning, systems of communication as journalists. However, it has also raised up the need for factual information and information that is actually constructive. So that balance is what we're going to have to continue to negotiate. But I'm glad to say that constructive journalism will make the negotiation easier.
All right, we have time for a few questions from the audience now. There will be one popping up in the screen that I hope I will be able to read out for you. Now, Benjamin Kempfer is asking, are there different approaches to the audiovisual style between classic journalism and constructive journalism? And maybe, Ellen, you can help us out since you have worked with so many diverse departments here, both in audio-video writers.
Yeah, there are a number of really interesting questions that arise when it comes to storytelling, but also to the visual concept of constructive journalism, because the visual level is often forgotten. But what do you see first when you open your magazine or your newspaper in the morning? It's a picture, right? And then it is really meta whether you show conflict or whether you show sadness or whatever, or you show hope. Solutions. It does make a big difference, and you can always, choose different angles to one and the same story. So why I always choose the negative angle, and why always, choose something negative on the visual level as well. And that's, something that can be changed rather quickly. It doesn't really cost more money, because these are always arguments, whoa, it does take so much longer to do some solution report. Yeah, but why not start with another headline? Why not start with another picture in your article, right? So there are ways to, get started without money and without much time.
Now, in order to actually learn about this, Ulrik, I would ask you, is it very crucial to have a specific training on this? Or can you just simply start by trying to focus on more positive aspects of a story? How would you, if someone is there and says, I don't have either the time or the money for actually getting a professional training, what tips and hints could you give?
I mean, you could go to some very good websites. You could go to the Solution Journalism website. They have some very good examples on how to do it. You can go to our websites. We have some curriculums. You have ideas, teaching tricks, and how you can go about doing it. Examples which you can try to be inspired by. Deutsche Welle also has something that you could look into. And that's what this is all about. And if I can say this, the three of us here, we might be considered hippies of the media world, and I think we should be proud of that. Remember what happened in the late 70s in Germany, in Denmark, and in the United States. Some hippies in ugly clothes walked around and thought there was something wrong in the way we produce food. The incentive structures in the farming industry was produce as much as possible, as fast as possible, as cheap as possible, right? And that has consequences. It was not, people were getting lousy food, and farmers were not really happy with that. And we destroyed the soil and society doing it. The animals were not treated well. We used too much pesticide and all that. So these hippies came up with this, that we must be able to do it differently. And boy, were they making a fool out of themselves in the beginning. Their carrots were small and not straight, but they continued to do it. And now the organic movement is a global movement. And people are sustainable ideas on to produce is maybe the fastest growing trend. This is the same thing with journalism. This is sustainable journalism. The idea that we have in the news industry not only produce as much as possible, as fast as possible, as cheap as possible. So we are proud members of a global hippie movement of sustainable journalism, and it will become mainstream. We will still have tabloid news, as we still have cheap burgers in the fast food restaurants. But the way consumers and producers of journalism now are more responsible in the way we consume and the way we produce, is really going to change the news industry. I'm certain of that.
On that, Ellen, how do you see the perspective in the next, say, 5 years for us here at Deutsche Welle?
Well, we'll have a great future, of course. But yeah, what Ulrik just said is right. I think that's the way to go. And I think Deutsche Welle has discovered that pretty early. We know from our audience research that people really want it. They watch Deutsche Welle, for instance, like, 2/3 of our people watch Deutsche Welle because they want to learn something. They want to know how do people solve problems they have at home. And it's all about knowledge transfer. And I think Deutsche Welle is really doing a great job. It's getting more and more. There are always, people who do have their prejudices, but I think we can win them over, being the hippies we are, as Ulrik just said. So I am actually pretty optimistic.
That's a very nice idea to close this panel. I am very happy to have been part of a discussion with these hippies, and I encourage all of you who are watching to really engage with constructive journalism, to find out more. The resources are there. You have the names, you have the institutions, and I am very happy and optimistic on that note that this is a type of journalism that is very modern and very, it makes a lot of sense for our age. Thank you very much to all three of you, Ellen Heinrichts, Ruona Meyer, Ulrik Haagerup, for this interesting discussion.